Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Celine and this is a place where I talk about all kinds of books, all of the different books. Today, however, I am doing a book haul. Did I need any more books? No, I did not. Did I buy more books? Yes, I did. I went to a charity shop recently where I can't resist the deals. I can't resist really lovely books for really low prices. So I bought a bunch of books, mostly classics, some non-fiction, and later this video I will also talk about what I'm currently reading, just to give you a bit of an idea of all the things that I read. The first book I bought was this bad boy. This is a collected edition of Shakespeare's plays, and it's from the 80s, but it's in a stunning condition. There's barely any yellowing or anything like that. And it is also illustrated, and the back tells me that there are exquisite black and white drawings and that there's 450 of them. I did not count, so I'm just going to believe them that there are a lot of illustrations in this, but it looks gorgeous, and I will insert a clip here, insert some video magic to show you some of the beautiful illustrations in this book. I have read some of Shakespeare's plays. I have read The Tempest recently, and I've also read Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet, but to be honest, it's still really early on in my sort of journey with Shakespeare. So I'm really looking forward to reading more of his plays. I have this goal to hopefully get through all of his plays. There's no time frame connected to it. I'm not going to try to like squish it into this year or anything like that. It's just a goal of mine to read all of Shakespeare's plays and then hopefully watch some sort of adaptation of all of his plays. So it can be a movie, it can be a play, whatever. Doesn't really matter, but I want to see it performed in some capacity. The second book that I bought is She-Wolves by Helen Castor, which is sort of a biography of 4 women who lived in the medieval period, who held power. So while they weren't like the ruling monarch, they were people with a lot of influence. And the 4 women that it discusses is Matilda, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Isabella of France, and Margaret of Anjou. And to be honest, I know very, very little about the medieval period just in general. So I'm actually really looking forward to reading this and finding out more about badass women in history, which is something I always enjoy reading. The next book I bought is The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad. I'm really looking forward to this, but I do have a slightly complicated relationship to Joseph Conrad, who wrote The Heart of Darkness, which is about a man who journeys into the heart of Africa. And it's quite a controversial novel in the sense of the way it deals with racism. I can't say I enjoyed it, because I think that would be odd to say considering the subject matter, but I did find Conrad's writing style very intriguing, which is why I picked this one up. I've also tried another book of his, I think it's called Lord Jim, and I DNF'd that for now. Hopefully I'll get back to it sometime. But this one sounded very interesting. It's supposedly a dark satire about a morally corrupt society, and something with an anarchist and terrorism, and I don't know, it sounds really interesting. It does sound very different from Conrad's seafaring novels, because he has a tendency to write a lot about the sea and being a sailor, which makes sense because he used to be a sailor, so that's part of his own experience that he's bringing into it. But this sounds more modernist, and I don't know, I found that intriguing, and it was only £1.50 and I couldn't leave it, so I had to have it, and I look forward to reading this. The next book I bought is Middlemarch by George Eliot, and this is a very old copy. I think it's from 1982 and it's yellowed, but it is very floppy. So I'm quite excited about that. I love a good floppy paperback. I don't know what Middlemarch is about. I couldn't tell you anything. But I would like to keep it that way. Sometimes with these long Victorian classics, I find that when people talk about what they're about, they have a tendency to spoil things, because these books are often so long. This one's almost 900 pages. So they'll be like, oh yes, it's about this and this, but then that doesn't happen until like 400 pages into the book. So I'm just going in blind. I'm going in knowing absolutely nothing about this, and I am just prepared to be amazed by George Eliot. The only other book I've read by George Eliot was Silas Marner, and that is one of those books where I was like, I was told something was going to happen, and it didn't happen until it was like halfway through the book, even though it was a small book, so it made me even more annoyed. But I enjoyed her writing style. It took me a moment to get into because she has a very strong authorial voice and she's very present in the text. Like she is telling you things and you have to listen, which I found a bit grating when I started reading Silas Marner. But in the end, it grew on me and I did find it very interesting. So I'm actually looking forward to trying Middlemarch, see how I go. Maybe it's not for me, but I don't know. I feel optimistic. I'm willing to give this a shot, even though it's absolutely massive. The next book I bought is actually a bit of a mistake. I bought Orlando by Virginia Woolf in this slightly horrifying movie edition. Not realizing that I already owned Orlando. I bought a vintage copy of Orlando a little while ago and I forgot. So I've got this edition of Orlando as well. Orlando is a fictional biography that she sort of based on a person in her life, Vita Sackville-West, which was her lover, friend. I mean, they had a complicated relationship in like a positive way, not in a sort of conflict way, but just a sort of, I think it's not easy to say whether their relationship was primarily romantic or platonic. It seems to be quite fluid, but they cared a lot about each other. And Orlando is a book that Virginia Woolf has dedicated to Vita Sackville-West. And I've read some of the letters between Virginia and Vita and some more nonfiction around them as people. And I'm really curious to see how I get on with this book. I am not great with Virginia Woolf's fiction writing. I absolutely adore her nonfiction writing. I love her letters, her diary, tons of amazing stuff that she's written. I love her essays as well. But her fiction, the only book that I've read so far of hers is To the Lighthouse when I was in my undergrad, and I struggled. I struggled so much that every single sentence felt like nails on chalkboard, and I am a bit scared to get into this. I started it, but I don't know if you can see that. I'm really not far in at all. But, you know, I hope that now that I've had some space away from it, now that I know her voice through her nonfiction writing, which I love, that I can sort of get into her fiction writing a little bit more easily, and that I get to enjoy all of the amazing ideas and stuff that she has done in her fiction writing. So I'm gonna start with Orlando before I move on to some of her like very famous works like Mrs. Dalloway, and I do kind of feel like I should probably reread To the Lighthouse at some point just to give it another chance, because I don't think I got anything out of it the first time I read it. The next book I bought is a little bit of an odd one. I bought the Earl of Chesterfield's Letters to His Son. It comes in this beautiful little box because it's a Folio Society copy from the 70s, and I got this for so cheap considering like it's an amazing state. There's very little like foxing or anything like that, and it's got some gorgeous illustrations as well, which I'll insert here. The main reason I picked this up is because of Virginia Woolf, because she discusses this work in The Common Reader, the second series. The Common Reader is an essay collection in which she discusses literature, but also letters, biographies, that sort of thing. And the way she discussed Chesterfield's Letters to His Son made me very intrigued. I was very interested in it. And when I saw it in the charity shop, I was like, you know what? This is an absolutely beautiful edition. I am interested enough to give this a shot, and I've already read it since I bought it as well, and it was fascinating. I really enjoyed having like this little sneak peek into an 18th century man and his hopes for his illegitimate son, because that is what this is. So this is a collection of letters that the Earl of Chesterfield is sending to his son, who is currently in the continent, and I don't think they've ever met yet. Um, and he wants to shape his son into what he thinks is the ultimate of a gentleman. So he wants him to dress well. He wants him to speak well. He has to fulfill all of the dreams of the Earl of Chesterfield. And is both very tragic and very fascinating to see what kind of advice he gives. Something that really amused me is that he's constantly like, you need to clean your teeth, which honestly, the fact that that was such a thing in the 18th century, like centuries ago, for your parents to be like, oh, you gotta brush your teeth. I just find that really funny. Um, but the Earl has these hopes for his son to be like this amazing orator in the House of Commons. And there's a historical note in this that says, yeah, by the time the son actually made it to England, after his journeying through Germany, Italy, France, he does the tour of the continent. His first speech in the House of Commons was a disaster, an absolute disaster, and I felt the shattered dreams of the Earl of Chesterfield. Even though those letters aren't really included in this collection, this is mainly a collection of the letters he writes um, that are still very optimistic about shaping his son into the image that he wants. But at the same time, I mean, I felt it, and it is interesting how a parent's hopes for a child, I feel like that is kind of timeless. I mean, the advice that he gives is not timeless. He's like, if you got any mistresses, make sure you don't tell them secrets, rather than tell, like, maybe you shouldn't have mistresses, maybe that's not a great idea. He's also very specific about, you can sleep around, but don't catch the syphilis, which he doesn't say, but he's always like, make sure you don't lose your nose, which basically boils down to don't get syphilis. It was a fascinating like glimpse into history, and I don't know, it was really interesting in a very odd way. And even though some of the letters were very repetitive, I really enjoyed this. So I'm kind of glad that I bought it. The next two books that I bought, I already owned, but hear me out, hear me out. They were very pretty. So I kind of wanted to have these editions. So these are two Bronte novels. So we've got Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre. And I do already own these. And I've also already read both of these. Wuthering Heights I read ages ago. And although I enjoyed it, I think the fact that I had heard so much about it, that there were so many expectations, it kind of influenced how I read the book. And it's been so long, it's probably been about 10 years, that I think it's probably time for me to try it again. And now I've got a gorgeous edition to read it in. And Jane Eyre, I enjoyed, but at the moment I'm reading Shirley by Charlotte Bronte, and I'm enjoying that way more, which makes me think I should revisit Jane Eyre after I finish Shirley. This neatly leads me into my currently reading section. I have a tendency to read a lot of books at once. I also have a tendency to forget half the books that I am reading. But we're gonna go with it. These are the books that I'm currently in the middle of, or at least a couple of the books that I'm currently in the middle of. These are the ones that I'm like actively reading. So the first one is Shirley by Charlotte Bronte. I am a little bit further than halfway through, and I am loving this book. So far I would say it's probably my favorite Bronte book that I've read so far. I love how it combines this social commentary, and particularly around the rioting that happened in the textile industry in Yorkshire, but just generally in the north of England during the Napoleonic Wars, so at the start of the 19th century. And the way she sort of weaves this, perhaps more sentimental love story kind of thing with that backdrop, and the way the female characters are actually engaged with this. I love this. I mean, the writing is fantastic. There's some really, really good writing in this and some amazing descriptions. Also, I just really, really love the main character, Shirley. So it has two female main characters, and I just love, I mean, Shirley is an absolute badass. and I really enjoy her. She's like an heiress and she's got a lot of money, which also means that she has a certain amount of power. She owns some land, etc., which means that she transgresses the norms of like what a woman should be like in ways that the slightly poor of the main character, Miss Helstone, can't do. But Shirley is a badass, and I really enjoy this book, and I really look forward to finding out how it ends. It's actually quite pacey, quite interesting. Like this stuff happening. So yeah, really enjoying Shirley. The next book I'm reading is The City of Golden Shadow by Tad Williams, which is the first book in the Otherland series, which is a 4-book series. I mean, this is a chunky boy. This is one that I've been working on for a little while. I have already read this book. I read it when I was a child. I think it was about 12 when I borrowed this from the library. It is an adult book. I mean, you can tell from the size alone. But I read this as a child, and I found it really interesting. It is about this world where, to be honest, I mean, when this was written, this was science fiction, but nowadays, I mean, VR and stuff. It's about VR, basically. But there's something wrong inside the VR. Like, people are not coming back. They go into it, and then something happens. I don't remember what happens, so no spoilers there. I am only this far in. So I enjoyed this as a child, but I don't really remember much about this. And I really want to read the full series. Like, I want to know where it goes, how it ends. Tad Williams, though, is quite wordy. I wouldn't say that he's long-winded. I do think there's a point to most to what he's writing. But it is long. I also own this one on audiobook, which is the primary way I've actually been reading this rather than this paperback version. And I think the audiobook is like 24 hours long, and I don't have a huge amount of audiobook listening time, so this is gonna take me a while. However, I am really enjoying it. I mean, there's some elements to it that have aged, I wouldn't say poorly, that have just aged. I mean, this was written like 20 or 30 years ago, so there are things. Just keep that in mind when going into it. I think generally it has been a very enjoyable experience, and I do look forward to finding out more and actually finishing the series, you know, after a decade. The third book I've been reading is How to Read a Poem by Terry Eagleton, and this is a book from the library. I don't know this book. I know a lot about literature. I know nothing about poetry. I'm still very much a beginner in poetry, and I thought it would be a nice idea to read a little bit of criticism about poetry. So that is what this is. And I actually think the title is a little bit misleading because it's not really about how to read a poem. Like, it really assumes a lot of knowledge in terms of like meter and just the formal qualities of a poem. It kind of assumes that you already know all these words. So I'm not sure this is really a book for beginners, but I do still find it very interesting. It discusses more about theory. So like different schools of theorists, what they have said about poetry and what poetry is. And, you know, I quite like that kind of thing, but maybe not if you're a beginner and you just want to learn like how to read a poem. That is not what this book teaches you. But, you know, I'm enjoying it in a sort of very slow kind of way. The last book I'm currently reading is 3 Guineas by Virginia Woolf, which is in this library copy that I have borrowed from the library. And I've already read A Room of One's Own, which is also in this bind-up. And 3 Guineas is perhaps sort of a sequel to A Room of One's Own. So A Room of One's Own is a very famous essay about women and writing, whereas 3 Guineas is also about women, but it's more about women and war, women and fascism, women and sort of the oppression within patriarchy. And I think it's incredibly well written, but it also makes me very angry and just slightly like actually upset, which is weird. Usually, even with feminist nonfiction, I can usually cope. In this one though, it just makes me so mad. It makes me so mad to read about just what men say about women and women's position and the value of women, and oh my goodness. But the way that Virginia Woolf deconstructs this is brilliant and is extremely well written. But it has been a struggle. Unlike a lot of the other essays that I've read by Virginia Woolf have been wonderful and an absolute breeze. And even A Room of One's Own was, it's not an easy read, but it's definitely a read that I found a lot of enjoyment in. Three Guineas, I do not enjoy it. There's no fun. There's no fun to be found in this text, which, let's be honest, Virginia Woolf was writing on the eve of war. So she was not out to have fun, which is fair. However, I am just kind of reading for fun. So it's a struggle. Will I finish it? I hope so. I want to finish it. I definitely have the intention to finish it, but it's definitely not one of the books that I currently have like in my rotation that I look for or that I pick up. So maybe I should just sort of force myself and finish this sometime soon. But we'll see. We'll see how I go. So those are the books that I'm currently reading and the pile of books that I recently bought at my shopping trip to the charity shop. And I would love to hear if you have read any of these, if you've heard of any of these. Let me know. Come say hi in the comments. I would love to have a chat with you, and I will see you in a next video. Bye!